one of our fabulous guests who's a regular, Vince Redmond, is on the line with us. And so we're going to do In the News a little bit later. Vince is a licensed marriage and family therapist, but he's been working in the field of autism for more than 2 decades and used to be a therapist. So he has an understanding of what it is that families are going through when they're doing an intensive behavioral intervention. So Vince, welcome back to Let's Talk Autism with Shannon and Nancy.
Good morning.
Good morning. And I didn't know till just now that Vince did not know that the topic we were talking about this morning was sex, but
sexuality with our kids.
And he is a consummate professional, though. He's up for it. And Nancy and I decided that we wanted to talk about this today, Vince. And then we didn't even announce it, but we had 2 questions that came in overnight from 2 different families. But wait till you hear how closely related these 2 questions are. Should I go ahead and read them?
Yeah. Let's do it.
So the first one is, my daughter is turning 13. She's always been fascinated with relationships, boyfriends, girlfriends, etc. In the past year, she's been interested in the sexual component too. We've worked with her a lot in and out of ABA on understanding relationships, appropriateness with peers, relationship boundaries, and safe/dangerous behaviors and their consequences. Although she is able to answer questions correctly about the material and understands what to do based on in-depth scenarios, she's having difficulty generalizing to real life. Recently, she has lifted her skirt and shirts to boys at school, hugged boys with and without permission, asked strangers to be her boyfriend, and has even asked a boy to have sex. We only hear of these things occurring after the fact, either directly from my daughter or from school staff. What can we be asking from the school to help support her safety? How can we bridge the gap between what she knows and the behavior she chooses, in the moment? And then someone else wrote in about a 15-year-old. She said, I have a 15-year-old daughter who is overly sexual, in quotations. During breaks or lunch, she's asking boys to be her boyfriend and has even asked a boy if he wanted to have sex with her. I have asked for an aide during breaks, but the school has been telling me that there is nothing they can do for her except mental health counseling every other week. We are already addressing this in ABA, but the problem is in her inability to inhibit these behaviors when she is around the opposite sex. I don't know what my options are. Please help. 2 different girls, oddly similar.
Right.
Striking. So Vince, let's start there.
Well, as a supervisor, the first thing a couple things are coming to mind again, and I just heard these questions. So the first thing that comes to mind is these are attention-seeking behaviors, right? So there's a lot of attention that's given. There's a lot of commenting. There's probably a lot of laughter. There's probably a lot of don't do this, let's do that. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? So we're getting a lot of attention. So we have to look at the child's attention-seeking behavior, right? Why is she in need of attention? Is she getting enough attention? Where's the attention coming from? What kind of attention is she getting? Is she getting more negative attention than positive attention? If so, we need to change that paradigm. Where are her focal points? Again, like you were saying, she's into boys, she's into peers. Okay, that tells you that that's the population in which we need to be working with. Now, the other thing that came to mind real quick was this is a prime example of why generalization of skills is necessary, where a lot of the funding sources, school agencies, and other governing agencies don't see that as an important step of the ABA process. This highlights the need for that generalization point. Just because she can do it in a therapy setting, or just because she shows understanding of it in maybe a natural environment setting, just when she's learning it, doesn't necessarily mean these girls actually know how to apply it. They're going to jump to the quick negative attention or the quick attention-seeking behaviors that they do to get this attention, because it's a lot easier for them than actually applying a new skill, finding that awkwardness of how to apply a new skill, making sure that we see that she's getting the functionally equivalent attention back, so that they don't have to do those types of behaviors. Now, when we're looking at those two girls, I don't know their abilities to really understand sexual relationships and love and intimacy and those types. And those are very broad, very conceptualized, very highly understood or difficult to understand concepts. However, when I look at this as a behaviorist, it definitely seems like the attention isn't there. We need to find a way to get the attention, and we really need to show scientifically to the districts that that generalization component is absolutely necessary if this behavior is going to change. They're at risk. These are at-risk girls that are at school, and without proper training and without proper treatment, it is still treatment. This isn't babysitting. This isn't we want her to have an aide just to watch her play. They need to be there to teach her how to gain positive attention by socially interacting appropriately, gaining peer trust, building social relationships, having conversations, playing appropriately in activities that they're doing. They're teens, so there's really not as much play, but there is a lot of conversations, a lot of social rules, a lot of social following, a lot of social observations that need to be made. They're not going to do that on their own without some type of without some type of prompting strategies.
It's all very scary because I'm sure, you take your child to school and then the school says, oh, this is happening. And it sounds like to me in both cases, the school is insinuating that the mom needs to take care of it. Right. But it's happening at school. This kind of stuff really frustrates me. But oddly, because one of them is 13 and one of them is 15, with the 15-year-old, I think there's less of an issue with the school because for the parent, they certainly can evoke the ITP and the individual transition plan and make this a part of that. Mm-hmm. That has to be in place by the time that they're 16, but they don't legally have to start it until they're 14. So for the 13-year-old, I would think, Vince, that they would have to go back and argue that in IDEA, it says, of course, we know, a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, which gives them the floor of opportunity. But the next sentence of it, which we don't often quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it memorized, but is something along the lines of so that they can work and contribute in society. Mm-hmm. That's the sentence I would think that you need to highlight to your school and say, this is why you're on the hook for this. And by the way, in a year when we start the ITP process, you're going to be on the hook for it then. And just don't let the school push you around. It's Absolutely. Essential that you get the school on board and have them helping. And for the one of them saying that they're going to give mental counseling every other week, I would also be writing them saying you're responsible for this behavior, and if something happens to my child or somebody else's, I'm holding you accountable. Put the fear of you know what in them, right? Right, Nancy?
Yeah, I say right. Yeah. But it depends. The other thing is how sophisticated are these girls and what they've been told about sexuality. Yeah. And this brings up, Vince, one of the things we were going to talk about, which is at what age do we start talking about sex with our kids? And obviously I know it varies for different abilities and different levels of functioning. But when do we start this topic and how do we deal with it?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the age, has some to do with it, but also level of ability, level of understanding, level of interaction, right? How much exposure do they have to other kids is going to have something to do with it. And but I think in general, you're looking at your teens, right? Right. I think, your early to late teens. So you're looking at your teen years, your middle school and your high school years to really start approaching it. It's not something, if you feel that your child has some understanding, some attraction to the opposite sex, some, either flirtatious behavior or maybe it's, just immature relationship building with the opposite sex, it's time to start talking about that, right? Kind of similar to what the mom had said in the question, in that you talk about it at home. You talk about what a relationship is. What do they do in a relationship? What is appropriate in a relationship? And that can be everything from hand holding to name calling. Now with social media, how to appropriately behave on social media, to maybe kissing, and then kind of slowly working it up from there, depending on what level of of involvement that they have, level of understanding that they have. The actual sexual act, the physical act of it, is just a very small component to that whole relationship, right? They're looking at that attraction, that attention that they get in a relationship, which I think, to a large extent, that's what we all have in a relationship. But really starting slow and working them up to that actual act so that they really understand that this is building relationships, and there are certain social rules that go along with it that are, acceptable for whatever, age group that they're in.
Vince,
I do think it's something to talk about, not avoid.
And what about let's talk about boys for a minute, because boys,
it's a whole different kettle of fish.
A whole different kettle of fish, and if they start having sexual urges and, let's say, erections and things like this, how do we deal with that?
Because I wanted to say too, I think there's a big misconception that people get squeamish talking about this kind of stuff, but and I would think that everybody would know this, but Vince, even if they don't understand the concepts, there's a certain point where their body is going to have a reaction. Right. Am I wrong?
No, you're correct. You're correct. And I think some of the difficulty comes in with, again, like you said, what they're comfortable with, religious aspects of what they want their child to know. So I know for us as clinicians, the first thing we need to do is talk to the family about, what do they want? What are the restrictions? What are some of the things that maybe prohibit us from exploring a certain thing? Because one of the topics that we often cover with our teens is masturbation,
right?
Which that is something that's very natural, and it's going to occur. How do we talk about this? How do we bring this up? What is the comfort level of the family, and how do we discuss this with the child? Like alone time in the bathrooms, those types of things. I mean, again, various variations, but like you said, at some point, a teen is going to have those physiological reactions where they have, erections, or they are getting sexually excited by stimuli. Sometimes it's stimuli that we don't typically see as sexual, but they're getting aroused by it. So we need to be able to talk to them about release, talk to them about how to appropriately satisfy those urges so that they don't get themselves in situations that could be dangerous.
Absolutely.
And so you suggest that we talk to them about it and give them pointers for dealing with it on their own.
Correct. I think that's exactly right. I mean, that's a good. We were talking about two different things, right? When we're talking about just education on relationships and sexual activity, and as they get into those teen ages, they're going to be exposed to that more often. And now we're talking. And then the other part of our conversation is the physiological, response that teens are going to have to, stimuli that arouse them. Again, it could be traditional stimuli or not, and that's when we have to talk to them about what to do with those urges, right? So that they're not in dangerous situations or putting themselves in harm's way.
And I guess there's no one size fits all, Vince, in terms of, because first the family has to decide what their preferences are. Yeah. Like, if it's how comfortable, as you said, Vince, how comfortable they are, what their religious ideas around it are. But then you have to find the way to then convey those parameters to the individual, which sometimes if the kids don't have a real great understanding, you run the risk of, if you bring it up too early, then you create something that you didn't want to create. Any tips for figuring out how and when then to bring it up once you've decided on what your boundaries are?
I think you pretty much know, right? I mean, I think when any sexualized behavior begins, either if it's just exploration, is it physical rubbing against something, hands in pants. I mean, again, depending on the level of the child, there's going to be some type of physical sign that they're, again, having, more than just morning erections, girls rubbing things between their legs. I mean, those are all indications that they're starting to be more aware of their body, and they're realizing that that there's a good feeling or a release feeling that they get when they do that. That's the time when we need to start talking about it.
Okay, so you see the behavior, and that's when you talk about it.
Right, but that's when we team up, right? That's when I don't want the families to feel that that's something that they're doing on their own. If they have an ABA provider, team up with your ABA provider, because we can systematically break down how to do this. Like, what would be the steps? Basically, do a task analysis of how to not only discuss it with them, but also possibly how to teach them how to appropriately, release.
And then, Vince, how do you deal with when something, because I think I've heard a lot of stories for autism parents that the first time that they realize, oh gosh, maybe we have an issue here, is that something happens in public. And it can be like, so embarrassing, and then you're dealing with other people's reactions. What would you say about that?
I would think it probably, oftentimes happens more often than not in public first for a lot of our kids, because they're not aware of the social, their social environments or the social rules that follow those environments.
Right.
They're looking at that self-satisfaction. It's like any stimulatory behavior, such as hand flapping or anything like that. It's a stimulation. It's a stimulatory behavior. So we need to teach them and talk to them about no hands in pants or no touching. But then the other side of it, just like we do with, say, hand flapping, we need to give them a way to get that sensory input. How do they get that sensory input? And that's where masturbation and those types of topics come up.
What about the actual talk about what sex is? When can we determine when our child is ready to talk about the more in-depth discussions of sex and what sex is?
Well, and again, there's no one size fits all. I wish there was, but when you feel that the child understands what it is, not only just physically entailed with it, but also what emotionally entails to it, it's time to start talking about it. And I think for me, as a clinician and as a father of two teens, I think that conversation needs to happen before we are put in, or before the kids are put in those situations. So when we see that they're starting to be sexualized, they're starting to feel, again, like we were talking about, more of those sexual arousals, if they have the comprehensive abilities to understand relationships, it's time to start talking about it at that point. That again, as I had said earlier, we kind of shelf it up or scale it up, where we talk about relationships and hand holding and kissing, and then as the relationship progresses, then there's sexual activity and what sexual activity is, and then whatever comfortability of the families, whatever religious convictions they talk about. This could be after marriage, this could be when you're an adult, whatever parameters parents want to put on it. That's when we continue, we talk about it, and continue to stick to the kind of the same analysis or the same I don't want to say story, but same progression of a relationship, so that they understand that.
Okay. So of course the comedian in me goes, so we can tell them no sex until they're 35,
right?
Because isn't that what we'd all like? Be convenient. But isn't it there's a little part of me that goes, I'll be honest with you, I was in a discussion with somebody about a month ago because there was an opportunity at my son's school to sign a piece of paper saying whether your child was allowed to talk about Planned Parenthood issues and whether they were allowed to talk to an Army recruiter. And it was very interesting meeting all these other parents, how everybody feels about that, because there are some people who are like, no, they are not allowed to talk to a Planned Parenthood person, but they are absolutely allowed to talk to an Army recruiter. And it was interesting to see everybody's comfort level. And the one thing that I walked away was like, do these people all think that at some point their kids, that the question isn't going to come up?
Right.
Like, is that the level of denial that, because I'd like to be in that level of denial,
me too.
But can we afford to do that? This is inevitable, is it not, Vince?
It is inevitable, and it's something that is going to have to be addressed. Now, again, there's certain levels of functioning where this might not be as much of a concern, but I'd say for the majority of all our families, this is going to be a concern. If not now, it's going to be later. To be perfectly honest with you, I'd be more scared with my child talking to an Army recruiter than them to learn more about sex, because I think the more educated that our kids are, again, at their level, the better knowledge and understanding they're going going to have when they're in those situations or when those situations occur. If they get a boyfriend, girlfriend, right, they're going to know that first it's this, then it's this, and just like they would any other process, and that sex is something that is a part of it, but it's something that happens later down the line. I would much rather educate and have an open conversation and also make them feel comfortable that they can ask questions about it, because who knows what understandings or questions that might come up. Giving them a comfortable spot to ask questions is going to be much safer than keeping it hush-hush and something we don't talk about.
And I want to say, too, for people who are like, no, I would have checked that, that they didn't want their child to talk to Planned Parenthood, if that's your choice, I think what we're saying is make sure that someone does. If you'd rather it be you, then, but just don't avoid the subject altogether and give them no information.
Yeah, sometimes a little information, though, can be harmful as well. I mean, I have a acquaintance whose child went up to a group of women and said, I want to get laid. Oy. And he didn't understand what that meant, but he said, please, can I get laid? And so clearly she was distressed when the child came home.
Of course.
How do I explain what this means to him?
Yes. Well, go ahead, Vince.
And that's a good conversation, right? There was a behavior that came up.
Yeah.
And that's an opportunity to, that's an opportunity, I guess is the best thing. You take that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Don't just be embarrassed, brush it under the rug and pretend it didn't happen. That's an opportunity, maybe not right then, but later that evening to discuss with him. When you said get laid, what did you mean? What did you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And then have a conversation about what it actually means and what it entails and what is the child looking for. Again, to me, immediately as a supervisor, I'm saying, okay, well, that was an attention-seeking behavior. But maybe it isn't. Maybe he is sexually attracted to them. He just doesn't know social rules. Mm-hmm. Okay, then that's a whole social rule issue we need to work on.
Right.
Well, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because a lot of things, especially if our kids are getting good level ABA, then they understand rules. Mm-hmm. And we can put it in a rule format and say, here are what the parameters are, and here are, this is the rule no matter what. I always go back to thinking about Temple Grandin and that her mother gave her the rule. You want to spin the little metal thing? You can. 1 hour a day in your bedroom, and that's it.
Right.
End of story. And she knew that her mom meant it and there was going to be no retraction on it. And it's interesting that she's an adult now, and she doesn't live in the same state as her mother,
right.
and she still spins the plate sometimes, but she keeps herself on a regimen because there are other things that she wants to do. This didn't harm her, and she knows that if she wants to go spin the plate to calm herself down, that she can. I always love that example, because sometimes parents are like, well, but I want them to be able to do it on their own. But or we should let them spin it as much as they want. Right? But there's a certain point when it prevents them from being able to do other things. And when we're talking about sexual things, I think we have to have boundaries.
Right. And I think we have to give our children what we call private time when we see sexual behaviors coming up. Right, Vince?
Right, and that's what I was talking about. I mean, one intervention that we have for kids is private time. So they'll have alone time. There's one designated area where they can go and be by themselves and engage in stimulatory behavior. Now, that could be anywhere from hand flapping to spinning plates, spinning wheels, to masturbating. Again, the idea, though, is the rule is no one is around, nobody can hear you, nobody can see you. Right, so that they understand that if they want to engage in that stimulatory activity, there is a social rule that is bound by that, right? If they're out in public, there's people around, people can see them, people can hear them, you can't do this. However, if you're home and you want to go to the bathroom or you want to go to your bedroom, close the door and engage in that activity, you have, like you were saying, an hour. Well, I wouldn't say an hour for that much, but or you have 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then when you're done, then you come out and that's it. That you cannot engage in that activity again, because that's an alone behavior. That's a behavior you do by yourself. And as you train and we coach this and we practice this and they do this on their own, like you said, we've taught a lifelong skill. It's not just what happens at home. This is what happens when they're adults and they're out in public and they have an urge. They now know I need to be by myself. I need to go home. I don't do this behavior in front of others. And that teaches them the proper way of self-stimulation.
Right.
It is hard because there are so many issues about this that are not black and white.
Right.
And I think too, as parents, we don't want to do anything that makes them feel bad about themselves, right? And it's a very fine line between saying, don't do this in public, but it's okay to do that. It's really hard. We have to align our facial features and make sure we don't freak them out about it.
Right.
Or shame them.
Yeah.
It's the last thing I think anybody wants to do.
Right. It's teaching them how to do it socially appropriate.
Yes.
I think it's also tough to decide when to have the conversation about what other levels as sexuality, other levels of sex and what it entails.
Yeah.
And when your child's ready for that.
Yeah.
Because they might latch on to some of those discussions and use them in an inappropriate way.
Yeah. I'm always, I think it depends on the kid, and I think that we all have an instinct, but, chime in here, Vince, when you want to, but I was always of the opinion that my son was going to hear things on the playground. He heard things on the playground way before I thought. I like to try to stay ahead of stuff so that I can be the first person. Like same thing with telling him about the word autism. I wanted to be the first person who had a shot at making him understand what that word, because I'm a control freak. And is that what you were thinking? Because that's what I was thinking. But I was the same way in 5th grade. They sent home the paper saying, we're going to do a presentation. We're going to take the boys in one room, the girls in the other room, and we're going to do the presentation, and you can opt your child out. And we talked about that, but I said, he's going to be on the playground afterwards, and they're going to be talking about it. And I would rather, so we had the conversation first and then let him go to the presentation. So by the time he got to the playground and people were saying stuff, and they said some pretty wild stuff. He was like, that's not it. I know it's not that. My mom told me, my dad told me, and the thing told me you're barking up the wrong tree.
Right.
But that was what was right for us. And I think it's different for everybody.
Right.
It is. And again, if we're looking for time, for ranges, I think some kids, they're exposed to it earlier than we think. But I think looking at middle school, high school, those are the ages that we have to start preparing for it. Though it might happen a little bit in elementary school and towards your 5th grade, 6th grades. But I do think when your child's entering middle school or junior high, depending on how your school system does it, that's a time where we need to really start being aware of it. That's a time we start looking at our child's behaviors. We start looking at the types of relationships they have with the opposite sex, and we use our best parental judgment on when to start that conversation, when to start teaching those social rules, when to collaborate with your ABA provider to make sure that not only it's done, collaboratively and systematically, but also so that we have each other to bounce things off of, so that we can come up with the individualized plan that's going to work best for your family.
And if they don't seem to be able to use, because one of the things that one of the moms was saying is that she's just not capable of inhibiting herself from doing this. What do you do then, Vince, when you've laid out all the rules and you've said here's and here's why we do this and here's what you're allowed to do, and they don't seem to be able to stop themselves, that it almost seems compulsive? Then what?
Well, again, it depends on the behavior and in what the function of the behavior is. If we're talking it's a self-stimulatory, issue, then maybe we have to have more self-stimulatory breaks throughout their day so that they're able to do things, not wait all day at school and then come home for alone time. Maybe there needs to be some type of an arranged alone time at school so that they're getting that stimulation at different increments, periods throughout the day. If it's an attention-seeking behavior, then again, we need to look at what is the functional replacement for the attention that they're seeking. Is this something where they just need more friends? They need to be active more in social activities. They need more, more work on social friendships. They need work on their social rules and social boundaries. all of these are together so that we're teaching how to appropriately attain positive attention rather than the negative attention that they're doing by flashing and saying comments that are getting reactions, right? Does she really understand? I want to have sex with you. Does she understand what that means, or is she doing that because there's a reaction to it?
Right.
Again, two components to it. One is the clinical component of what we need to teach. The other component to this is, as parents, it's time to start talking about sex. It's time to start talking about what intimate relationships, I think is a better way of saying it, what an intimate relationship really involves, and how that progresses, and what is appropriate age group for that. I mean, the 13-year-old, definitely not. Talking about that again, our kids are very rule governed. They understand parameters. They very much understand. They like to stay in the lane, right? They like to understand these are the boundaries of this certain behavior. So a lot of times in behaviors like sexuality, there is really no boundaries because they're really individualized. It's time that we start making that with the family so that the child then understands this is the lane they stay in, this is what they understand, and this is the behaviors that they need to continue to either adhere to or ask questions about.
Yeah, I have to say, though, I think what's key is that we have to not be in denial about it. And I mean, just this last week, we covered a story, Vince. There's a film out right now called So Be It. Excuse me. And it's based on an award-winning young adult book that was written for 10-year-olds, that it's very popular with 10-year-old girls. And the story focuses on a little girl and finding out this mystery, but there are other elements to the story. And so when the film was made, which is very true to the book, they gave it a PG-13 rating. Even though it was a book for 10-year-olds, they gave it a more mature rating. And part of the reason why is because ultimately you discovered that her parents were both people who the mother had autism, and we don't know what the dad's diagnosis was. But I think even the movie industry, and looking at ratings, finds it so squeamish to think about people with disabilities and having sexuality, intimate relationships. Right. And that there's a level of denial among the people who are dealing with those people on the film, and it's reflected in the rating of the film. It's like nobody wants to talk about the fact that this happens. Right.
That our kids are going to have sexual feelings.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. Our kids are just like everybody else's. Our teens are just like everybody else's. They're going to have hormones. They're going to have those arousals. They're going to have fetishes. They're going to have things that
and they're going to be attracted to other people, right, and fall in love like other people.
Yes.
Which I think a lot of people just think that's not a thing.
It's never going to happen.
Right. Which is there's a level of sad there, but
like you said, what we're doing right now is exactly what we need to be doing, bringing it to more of an awareness, right? Bringing it more to the popular and the populace, to the medium of this is going to happen, right? A lot of our early intervention kids are now teens, young adults. So as the progression of not only the field, but our kids continue to develop, so does the awareness, so does the ABA education, so does the parental education. The more that we're able to talk about it and experience it, I think the more we're not only helping the families that we're talking directly to, but I think we're helping the field in a whole, because it's not going to stop.
Yeah, we got to stop being squeamish about it.